Welcome to our podcast, Between the Fence Posts, where we discuss all things related to agriculture and how they impact our local communities here in East Tennessee. Whether you're a farmer, gardener, or just looking for some updates about the ag world, we're glad you're here with us. Give us a like and subscribe to receive updates for our latest content. Thanks again for being here. Now, let's get into our next episode. All right, folks, well, welcome back to Between the Fence Posts. I'm your host, Ryan Brown. And today, on our first full-length episode, we got a really special guest with us here. Josh, go ahead and introduce yourself to the folks at home.
Yeah, so I am Josh Daugherty. I've been working with Extension for 5 years now. March 16th was my official 5-year anniversary. I'm working in Morgan County. I proclaim myself to be a little bit of a weirdo in Extension in that I am one of the few people whose main focus is forestry, wildlife, and fisheries. At this point, I'm lucky enough now that I'm working with the Eastern region doing the fisheries program, doing that with Manny Bedwell. But yeah, so that's my main program area is telling people about forestry and wildlife and fish.
You're not a weirdo by any stretch of the imagination. For some of us, like yours truly over here, that's a dream job. Whereas I focus on the production ag side more so than anything else, and then homeowner calls with folks on near the lake of Douglas and Cherokee, things like that. So yeah, I will say Josh is a very, very awesome guy. We've been trying to get together and hunt for the last turkey season and deer season. It just seems like every time we have something planned, either I'm sick or one of my kids is sick, so that's just how life goes. But we plan on doing that this spring. We'll have to get together and get after some turkeys. Speaking of that, it is springtime. It is March 21st. March Madness was yesterday. The Vols won. Everybody's happy around Knoxville right now. And turkey season is what? Are we 3 weeks out or 2 weeks?
Right at it, yeah. April 12th, if I'm not mistaken.
April 12th. It's my brother's birthday, so yeah, we're 3 weeks out from tomorrow.
Yep.
I'm ready.
With any luck, it'll be the last time it's mid-April when season starts.
Let's not get too political already.
Starting off rough.
Yeah, we're anyway. Moving on. But no, that is something that we get asked about sometimes. Yeah. Like, why do you move seasons back? And there's a lot of reasons for that, and for and against it. We won't dive into necessarily on the podcast today, but we'll gladly discuss that with you on an individual basis, I guess.
One thing I will say is I think it was a good thing to try it and see what happens.
Absolutely.
So I will go with that and leave it there.
I think of course, there's been studies and studies, and I know as a shameless plug for the podcast we were talking about earlier with Dr. Lashley.
Wild Turkey Science.
Turkey Science. Yeah. So Dr. Goldsby and Dr. Lashley are from Auburn and Florida, respectively there, and they have a podcast, and they were talking about some studies about how different factors impact harvest rates and breeding habits and things like that of wild turkeys, which we'll get into that a little bit later, but anyway, we're already off on a tangent here. We're not even talking about what we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's kind of, if you want to know who Josh and I are on a personal level, that's kind of who we are. Is we're outdoorsmen. We love to hunt, love to fish, and Josh gets, like I said, I'm jealous because he gets to do that on a daily basis with his job, specifically in Morgan County.
It is a dream.
So
loving it.
That's good. So let's dive right in. And so the theme of our episode today, for those of y'all listening out there, is how wildlife management projects can benefit production ag. And I feel like there is and correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but there is a stark difference to the approach if you are producing an agricultural product specifically, or if you are managing for wildlife. Now, that is today's picture. However, back even 30, 40, 50 years ago, those were pretty much married at the hip. And our production practices have come a long way in the last half century, I think, both for the good, but also for the negative side of some wildlife. And so what I wanted to focus on today was kind of what are some ways and some practical methods we can include in a production ag setting while also benefiting wildlife. And one of the things that came to my mind is because I'm on the project, and your county director Jenny Goodrich is on this project as well through USDA, is through the GRASSLANDS partnership. And so that one of those methods is using native grasses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't know about the native grasses of Tennessee and even how to use them really and what they are. So can you kind of dive into what the major native grasses are in Tennessee and what benefits they bring to wildlife specifically?
Yeah, so our big species, the main ones are going to be big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass, and eastern gamma grass. Those are going to be the main species. I will say you can't think about these grasses as being things that these species, most of our wildlife species, are going to use exclusively. So if you roll the clock back, a couple hundred years or beyond, and think about what our landscape used to look like, these grasses would obviously be around, but they would be in conjunction with a lot of our native forb species. So the ideal use of a lot of these when it comes to wildlife, again, I guess we're going to get into blending the two together here in a little bit, but when we're talking solely wildlife, a lot of times the idea is we're looking at like a 30-40% grass component and the rest of that being forbs and shrubs. And if you have that, then a lot of our wildlife species are super happy. So, if you take a few kind of individuals, if you look at quail, they're going to be a seed eater, obviously. So like a lot of your native grass seeds, they will consume, specifically switchgrass. They tend to enjoy those seeds quite a bit, and they will use those habitats to nest in. If you did have solely native grasses, they were going to nest there. To a lesser extent, brood there. It's not exactly ideal, but it's better than, say, fescue, for instance. So they'll use those quite a bit, but ideally, again, you're going to have that mixture. They prefer that roughly 30% grass component. But where our native grasses grow in these clumps, they're a good spot for a nest to just plunk right down in there.
Be right in the middle of them.
Yeah. So they do pretty well with that as far as nesting goes. Mobility for chicks can be kind of the key issue there. Specifically, that's one of the big reasons why fescue is a struggle for bobwhite. And I don't want to harp on fescue too much, but it is what it is.
Well,
it's what we have.
It's the predominant grass we see in in Tennessee in general.
Right, and so we kind of have to look at, when we think about declines of bobwhite, we have to think about the increase in
those
fescue.
Just so happen to coincide with one another.
Yeah, so hopefully a lot of the cattle guys and production guys aren't going to get too mad at me right off the bat here and tune out.
They'll be all right. They'll be all right.
But so that's kind of the thing we're looking at with bobwhite. Same thing with turkeys. They're going to nest in those areas. They'll really prefer what dictates a successful nest for a turkey a lot of times is lateral cover. So being able to have roughly eye level visibility for that turkey, so that hen can know what's going on around it, but also having that like really spread out, so like having an abundance of it. So sometimes we think about a turkey nest just being up against the back of a tree and having maybe some dead wood around it and whatever, that not that great.
Yeah.
But if you can get a turkey in a sea of native grasses and forbs, they're probably going to be all right.
Right.
And then too, of course, that's a food thing for turkeys as well. So they're gonna eat all those seeds that come from those grasses. They're gonna eat those seeds that come from the forbs. They're gonna eat some of the basil, the leaves and the stems of those plants. And same thing for deer.
A lot of bugs too there for turkeys.
A lot of bugs. Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong. That's one of the biggest, I guess, for poults specifically. Mm-hmm. That is one of the most crucial things to get them high protein content, because the faster they can get off the ground from predators and nest raiders and everything like that, the better off they're going to be.
Yep. And so a big part of that is forbs will be more attractive to bugs, and so they're a lot more prevalent, and so it's going to help those turkey poults and those bobwhite poults quite a bit getting to that point, because like you said, the more they have of that, the quicker they're flying.
Yep, the faster. It's a race to get your flight wings, basically.
Yep, and that is a huge indicator of poult survival is the quicker they get there, the better.
Right.
So, and then same thing with deer too. So, they're not gonna hang out a ton in just native grasses because, grass isn't a huge part of their diet, but it is good bedding material. So mostly at night, so most deer aren't bedding in open fields during the day, but they make good night bedding areas. And again, if we kick it back to having areas that are a mixture, a lot of those forb species are crucial for deer as far as, does that are pregnant and developing fawns, and then also bucks putting on antlers. Those forbs are a huge nutritional
high protein, just
yes,
like
sir.
turkeys need the bugs for high protein.
Yes, sir.
Forbs are extremely important for antler growth.
Yep. And so I will make one kind of caveat. There is a group of species that do prefer a higher grass component, and that of course would be some of our grassland songbirds. So you think about things like meadowlarks, dick thistles, grasshopper sparrows, field sparrows, those kinds of things that, they're kind of aptly named. They prefer a higher grass component, but still yet, if we roll the clock back, a lot of those places were not completely dominated by those grasses. So the ideal setup for wildlife is having that mixture.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's something that you hear. Mixture is the word that's the buzzword, I think, right now. In a lot of circles in some ag communities, is that, when you go to plant something, particularly like a pasture, for example, we'll kind of switch it to a little bit of the production ag side of it here now and talk about some of the benefits there. But if you have a monoculture of grass, whether it's fescue, orchard grass, timothy, whatever it might be, even Bermuda grass, whatever, that is, it's easy to manage for, but also very difficult at the same time. There's two sides to every coin. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
And so, like you mentioned, we were talking about before we hopped on here, is that there was a field day over at one of the research centers, and a lot of the native grass pastures had some, pollinator type attractiveness to them and things like that. Whether it be, blooms from forbs or, other types of what we would say browse for white-tailed deer and some of those broadleaf species. And that's a little bit of diversity in the landscape is not bad.
Right.
It's ideal for wildlife. For a production ag standpoint, sometimes, and again, I think that's where we've really not necessarily farmed for monocultures, but in a way, that's why we have seen, I think, a lot of the declines in some of our wildlife species in some areas. Like, how many coveys of bobwhite quail have you found in your entire life?
In my life?
Yes.
In the wild?
Yes.
None.
I have found one, and I'm not afraid to. I'm ashamed to say it. We were rabbit hunting in Middle Tennessee. I may have been a freshman in college, something like that. And it was a real nasty, thick spot with a log that was kind of suspended over it. And perfect spot if you're a rabbit hunter or seen somebody rabbit hunt. You go over there and just kick it real fast and flush a rabbit out of there. I flushed them out of there. It was a covey of about 15 quail.
It'll scare the crap out of you, won't it?
One of them hit the brim of my hat. I was like, okay. Anyway, yeah, it was. I was totally taken aback, and I was shooting a 410 shotgun at the time. My uncle was like, "Why didn't you shoot one?" I said, "I'm not going to shoot a Tweety bird, and I'm not going to do that to one." And he said, "Those weren't Tweety birds. That was bobwhite quail." And I'm thinking, and I have yet to see another covey of quail, even hear some. And so, but my granddad, that's all he hunted. And that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
And everybody had bird dogs, it seemed like.
Yep.
But now you have to intensively manage a place so much, and your neighbors have to do it.
That's a big one.
And I think one comment that I want to make here is, not before we get sidetracked, but we manage property lines now.
Yeah.
We manage within property lines. We don't manage the landscape. And the reality is that wildlife use the landscape.
Yep.
And if the landscape within each property boundary is all the same, whether it's, various species or not, then, they're kind of at a loss. And so they have to make do with what they have, essentially, is what they've done.
Yeah.
And again, we're not here to slam monocultures or anything like that. But
it's the most efficient thing for production ag, though. That's all we've done is we
yes,
found the most productive thing and went with it.
Exactly. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But again, there's two sides to every coin.
Yep.
When you do that, you're going to give something up.
Right.
And so just like there's not nearly as many rabbits as there were out there,
right,
even when we were kids.
Yep.
You know, and that's been not that long.
Right.
Really hasn't been. And so I remember going and running, 12 to 15 rabbits a time. But, buddy, if you run 6 to 7 now, it's a good day.
Yeah.
Which is really, really sad.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think you made the comment thinking about hay production.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants weeds in their hay.
Right.
Nobody wants to have, whatever it might be out there that's going to be beneficial for wildlife in a hay bale. Because then you're putting that on your farm and cows are taking, or, livestock are taking it wherever. And then it just kind of tends to be a snowball you have to deal with then, which is understandable. But you hit the nail on the head. It's the most efficient and cost-effective way to do things, which again is what we preach a lot of in extension. If it's it's not economically feasible,
what are you doing?
Yeah, don't do it.
It's hard enough out here.
Yeah, we're pinching pennies as is already.
Yeah.
I mean, when it comes to and heck, look at the price of eggs. Lord help, people at home got a penny pinch now all the time just to buy a dozen eggs. It seems like.
Yeah.
That's been a hot topic lately. So,
yeah.
But okay, well, so the big three I think are what people really tend to ask us questions about when it comes to native grasses. You mentioned like eastern gamma grass, Indian grass, but I think the three big ones are switchgrass, little blue stem, and big blue stem, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So can you talk about some of the environments you might find those in, or which ones are more adaptable to, say, a lowland type or an upland type soil? Which ones would you choose if you're going to implement one of those in a certain spot? Where would you do that?
So where they would come out naturally, a lot of times your big blue, little blue, they're going to be more upland species. You're going to find those on, I believe the word is xeric, more drier sites, as opposed to more mesic sites.
I'm glad you understand that word because I don't remember that from Intro to Soils 210 there.
Well, hopefully somebody smarter than me doesn't listen to this and go, that's backwards.
Yeah,
that's not even how you say that. But, so typically those guys are going to be the big blue, little blue, those kind of species are going to be found more in your upland sites. And switchgrass can handle some wet feet a little bit more, so it does all right in some of those more lowland areas. But, they'll mix up enough to be you would find them naturally mixed together in some places, but
right.
dominant
types.
Dominant.
Yeah.
That would be the way to say it. Is more upland for big blue, little blue, and
okay, gotcha. One of the challenges, and we've dealt with this a little bit and kind of been preached to about establishing native grasses. When you talk about establishing native grasses, that's one of the hardest things to get people to understand. Mm-hmm. You're dealing with really small seeds.
Really small.
You have to have a very well-defined seed bed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got to be done and be done right.
Yeah.
And so whether you're tilling up a piece of ground or whether you are using herbicides, which I'm pretty sure we've got the book sitting in front of us here from Dr. Kaiser, but we were sitting in a training one day and he was like, you've got to be very vigilant on your herbicide use with this, because if you don't control this vegetation, it's just going to get taken over again. Mm-hmm. And so I think let
me ask a clarifying question there.
Yes, go for it.
Was he referencing somewhere that had been a cool season grass in the past, and that's what he meant was going to retake over, or was he referencing something else?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, for example, we had a guy on a webinar with us one day. I believe he was from Kentucky, and he worked with like the highway department. They were working a lot of those natural right of ways around the interstates and state highways, things like that. And instead of having some of that stuff, they wanted to reintroduce, instead of having tall fescue or Bermuda grass, they wanted to reintroduce native grasses to the landscape.
Love that.
And include some pollinator seed and habitat, things like that, some natural forbs, and overall kind of improve the aesthetic, but also use for wildlife. And so, and for a municipality, it's a lot cheaper to not have to mow that and just let it grow up
yeah.
every year, or just burn it once every.
Stick a sign out there that says for wildlife, and avoid that having to mow it. And
no mowing, no spraying.
Yeah,
I mean, and people will probably roll their eyes at that, but you think about it from that standpoint, it does save. Think about how many times that stuff gets mowed. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe not along the interstates; those get bush hogged probably twice a year.
Yeah,
but still, how many man hours it take to do that in a bat wing? That takes a lot of manpower and a lot of time to do that.
Yep.
And so, from that standpoint, we were learning some of that too. So, to answer your question, is that he was coming at it from both a cool season sod base like tall fescue, or just warm season mixtures that you want to
annuals, things that you're trying to,
a lot of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, but again, like you mentioned, that mixture, that 30 to 40%, and for those of y'all who have never seen native grasses, I'm trying to envision, or you can't really explain it. Johnson grass isn't the best example, but I think that's the closest example that I can give as far as the structure of these types of grasses.
Yeah.
It's kind of a clump grass.
Yeah.
But the height-wise is what I'm trying to get at, because these natives can get how tall? 4, 5, 6.
Some of them get 7, 8 feet tall.
Yeah, they're
if you just let them go.
Let them go.
Yeah.
And so from that aspect, kind of leaning back towards the production ag side of things, I'm talking about a lot of forage out there. Mm-hmm. Man, that's a bunch of stuff. So even amongst what we would call weeds in a pasture scenario, that's a lot of groceries out there.
Oh, yeah.
A bunch of them.
For sure.
And I also think about species like, we've talked mostly about cattle production thus far, and it's what mostly is in, I think, East Tennessee, but we have more and more folks moving towards small ruminants, especially your beginning farmers and your younger folks. Yes. And so sheep also will eat grasses, but they also eat forbs too. Mm-hmm. And so that is a literal buffet. It's kind of like if we went down to Ryan's Steakhouse or one of the other, it's not a plug for Ryan's Steakhouse, but that's my name, so that's easy to remember. But if you go to your country buffet down the road,
right,
that's essentially what it is for a sheep.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people don't think about it that way. They want a nice, clean-looking field of grass, but really you could benefit so much from having a little bit of variety in there.
Yeah.
So anyway. But yeah, seedbed preparation, the weed control aspect is something I know Dr. Kaiser's talked about with us, and he really preaches on as far as if you're going to do it right. Do it right the first time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a process. It's not the easiest thing in the world, and I don't know a ton. I'm not obviously like super in depth on that part, but I do know enough that it is certainly the process. You want to make sure you have a really fine seed bed. Mm-hmm. You want to make sure, obviously if we're prepping seed bed, you want to make sure that all of the whatever was there previously, whatever it was, is gone.
Yeah.
So you've mowed it, burned it, sprayed it, whatever, and it is no longer there. So getting that really fine seed bed, and that's also what's going to be kind of what helps you prevent weeds in that establishment time period.
Yep.
So, when we think about these native grasses, they're not pioneer species.
Nope.
So when you have a piece of land that has just been set back to either bare ground or whatever, we'll just say bare ground to make it easier thought process. Okay, yep. These native grasses are not going to be the first thing that comes back. You're going to have some mostly forb species that are going to come back right off the bat. Some annual grasses, but we're talking about grasses primarily that are perennials, that are long-standing species. Mm-hmm. So they part of that not being a pioneer species is that their germination rate time is a lot slower. So once you plant that, there's going to be a period there where you're very vulnerable to weeds coming in, and obviously that's going to affect how well your stand of native grasses comes in. So having that really prepared seed bed is one of your best defenses against that. Right.
Yeah. The more seed to soil contact, the better off you are.
Yep.
And by getting that fine particle seed bed ready and prepped and doing it and pulling the trigger at the right time, ideally if you could do it right before it rain, that's obviously in a perfect world, that's what you do. But we don't live in a perfect world, unfortunately. So getting that done the right way the first time is extremely crucial. I agree. But also the planting window for native grasses, I think, is pretty wide. You know, you can do them from mid-May to 1st July.
I actually think April.
Or no, it's April. That's right.
Early or mid-April
That's
is kind
right.
of the opening. And you can do it all the way through July. Of course, a lot of that is soil temperature dependent.
Sure.
So I think, if I'm not mistaken, ideally mid-April is typically about the time that's best to get them in the ground. You know,
Gotcha.
same thing with cool season grasses. We can plant them in
there's a window.
tiny window.
Yeah.
But it's different than those cool season grasses where we're trying to get those in the fall.
Sure.
We're trying to get these warm season guys in around mid-April. I think the 65 degrees is the soil temp we're looking for.
About what you want for about soybeans, I'd say. That's
Yeah.
about the earliest you ever want to plant beans. You hit the nail on the head. Timing about mid-April. Ironically, that's when tall fescue is going to be flushing and trying to just grow like a madman. And so if you're trying to take one of these areas that has a lot of tall fescue and reestablish some or reintroduce some native grasses in a tall fescue dominated area in the past, you better make darn sure that fescue is not going to come out of the ground again.
Right.
And so you're looking at, we mentioned herbicides, probably an application in the fall, the previous fall, probably an application in the spring.
Yep.
And then if you're burning off a big sod base, you may be burning it, honestly, burning down that dead plant material.
Yeah.
So because you want sunlight exposure.
So it might be a little bit different for native grasses.
Yeah.
But if, for instance, if you're trying to implement some early successional habitat, so this is kind of the stuff I deal with more than the native grasses. But anyway, it should be relatively similar. So if we're trying to get rid of a mat of fescue grass,
Yes.
the way to do it is to come in and mow it at least once, kind of August-ish. Later the better, ideally. At least once. If you can mow it twice, that's great to kind of knock it down and make it not very happy.
Yeah.
And then so after you mow it, of course, you have developed this big thatch layer.
Sure.
Come in and burn it. Okay, so you want to burn off all that thatch layer and expose as much of the ground as possible.
Right.
And if we're trying to get rid of those cool season grasses, then after that first frost is when we want to come in and spray it, because all those warm season plants that we might be trying to protect, for the most part, what I'm talking about with
For early succession type stuff, yeah.
We're trying to protect those.
Yeah.
So we want to wait till they have gone dormant for the year, and those cool season grasses, that fescue is still kicking, around the time of that first frost, and that's when we spray it.
Yeah.
So mow it, burn it, spray it.
Yeah.
And then that's a relatively effective control.
Right.
So that would set you up going into that next year.
And that's in the fall of the year.
That's in the fall of the year, yeah. And then, like you said, you probably want to spray again before you try and plant those native grasses.
Yeah. So what you mentioned the word process earlier.
Yeah.
This can be a daunting process to some, but it's a very doable process. And I want to go ahead and throw this out there. We're not here saying put your whole farm in native grasses, because there's a tool in the toolbox for every situation. I may or may not have been accused as using some things as a hammer in the past. That wasn't a hammer, maybe the end of a screwdriver per se, but I was in a pinch and I needed to get it done really quick. So don't treat it as that. Don't treat it like a tall fescue pasture, or don't treat it as a tall fescue hayfield. I've seen, and a lot of times, talking about diversity in the landscape, try it on a very small acreage. See how you like it.
Yep.
But from a production ag standpoint, like in grazing scenarios, in a drought like we had this past year, native grasses are about the only thing that would have stayed perfectly green.
Yep.
Because those roots go how deep?
Deep feet.
Yeah, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yep.
Probably plus that.
Yep.
So they can tap into a lot of moisture that our cool season grasses just can't do it, and they're doing it at the most difficult time of year. I think that's what people. That's where people get so hung up. Is like, it can't make it through that summer. Yes, it can if you do it and establish it the right way and give it the time that it needs. it'll pay dividends in the long run for you.
Well, think about it this way. It's a native grass.
Bingo.
It developed where we're at, and so that grass is like I said, it's developed to do its best production when we're having those crappy, hot, dry summers.
Right.
So, I mean, that's really the way to look at it is, and same thing with fertilizer. You're going to have to fertilize it less because it's used to the soil that we have. So I'm not going to say you can't fertilize it, but I'm going to say it's less necessary than it would be for fescue or something of the like. And like you said, you don't want to just all at once on a whim convert your whole farm.
That's like hitting the self-destruct button all at one time.
Yeah. So, and you said, it's a tool in the tool belt. The way to look at it is just the easiest thing to do is look at a chart that shows the growth of both of those grasses side by side through the year.
Totally different times.
Yeah.
Totally different times.
So what you'll see is there in the spring that those cool season grasses are doing their best, and then they have that lull in the summer, and then they pick back up in the fall.
I call that the summer slump.
Yeah.
That's what it is, man.
Guess what fills that gap?
Your warm season native grasses, potentially.
Warm season grasses, yep.
And, like our drought was so bad last summer in 2024, they could put it in perspective for you. Like, even crabgrass, I've done some warm season demos with some folks in Jeff County, and even the crabgrass they had sown as the demos, it was almost dead. Like, I mean, and crabgrass is it's tough, and it's tough to kill. And I was just like, okay, well, we're not going to have a lot of demo data from this year, but it is what it is. But your natives will persist through that, and that's directly attributed to the root system that they have because, like I said, it's feet deep, and it is extremely impressive what they can do with so little. Yep. So little.
But
go ahead.
Small caveat to that, though.
Go for it.
One thing you have to think about, we talked about earlier where those grasses have that longer germination period, so you're vulnerable for a little bit. Another thing about those native grasses is they're putting a lot of effort into that root system when they're first developing.
Yes.
So they don't exactly take off at the same rate, even once they've popped up and they're visible there. They don't take off the same speed that fescue will. So they have everything has a pro and a con.
Oh, yeah.
And so I just want to throw that out there that, even though they are great in that summer slump period, and they do withstand the drought, and they do perform better even with less inputs than fescue.
They're not a silver bullet.
They're not. And establishment has some issues to it.
Yes. And so that's a perfect segue. Act like we didn't share notes before this or anything. But that's a perfect segue to our last point in talking about if you are the person out there who's like, maybe I do want to include native grasses into my livestock operation, or whoever you might be. But that's kind of the person we're targeting with this specific point next is that, you can, and Dr. Pedrera is really big right now. He's our new forage specialist for UT, and he is very big on building resilient systems. And about the most resilient thing you can get out there is a native grass, in my opinion, personally. But you got to treat them the right way. And when I say that, I mean the above ground growth on a plant, just basic agronomic principle here. The above growth on a plant is a direct reflection of the root system. So tall fescue tops out about 18 inches, something like that, whereas native grasses can go multiple feet high. It's a direct reflection of what the root system is trying to do on the bottom side of that soil line. Now, with that being said, you mentioned it, the establishment phase. What a lot of people do, even with your cool season grasses, you'll plant them, they get up about knee high or shin height, something like that, 8, 10, 12 inches. Let them go graze it. Don't do that with native grasses.
Oh, bad idea.
Bad idea. Very bad. You'll be very upset with yourself. And what you want to do is ideally in a perfect world, and this is again goes back to that principle of don't put your whole farm in it, right?
Yeah.
Do a little bit, 2 acres here, do maybe another 2 acres the next year, whatever. but you want to set aside that specific area and do it in the spring, or do it in that planting window we talked about earlier. And then you basically want to let it rest the entire rest of that year.
Yep.
And then the first time you're going to be able to graze it is almost 12 months later, practically.
I think what I read in this book earlier today, the one from Dr. Kaiser, was it's about 13 months before you're ready to turn out.
Yes. And in a perfect world for production ag, that's not ideal.
Nope.
However, again, it goes back to the principle. Just diversify a little bit at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Do 2 acres here. We're not doing the whole farm, because that seed can also be pretty expensive as well. And I think that's what catches a lot of people. From my side, I've got folks that are interested in native grasses, but they don't want to wait 12 months to be able to graze them.
Understandable.
And I get it. I do, because dollars are tight. Mm-hmm. Cattle are still high right now, but, that's not always going to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And so whenever you're talking about taking out, and a lot of the farms here in East Tennessee, we're small farms. We're looking at anywhere from, majority of the time, it's between 40 and 75 acres, I would say, as far as a commercial production type farms for livestock anyway. And a lot of them can be smaller. And that's not necessarily just owned ground. That's leased, permission, handshake, or whatever it might be.
Yep.
That's total operation size. That's teensy tiny to a lot of folks. To the grand scheme of ag, that is tiny.
Yeah.
But you got a 100-acre farm here in Tennessee. It's like, oh, you got quite a bit of land to roam on. I'm like, yes, we do. To us, but again, in the grand scheme of things, it may not be ideal to do all across your farm. And we're not sitting here preaching, hey, do it all across every single acre you got. Use it as a tool in the toolbox to develop a resilient program that benefits your operation, but it can also bring some benefit back to the landscape for wildlife species. And I think that's kind of where the core of our conversation really needed to. I think we've successfully done that. Correct me if I'm wrong. You have anything else to add there?
Not really. Mostly just that, if you are interested in this, you really need to take into account that there is going to be some give and take.
Absolutely.
It is what it is. It's part of it. And I think if I were to add anything to it, I think I would mention that if you've got the space and you can put some stuff in your native warm season grasses, because of the way those grasses grow, right? So they don't form a mat like fescue does.
Right.
They grow in those clumps, and what that does is create space in between clumps. And so if you are interested in putting that down, consider that in those open spaces, you want to allow for some what we would normally call weeds in production agriculture.
Precisely.
But in the wildlife world, we call forbs.
Yes.
So allow, don't feel like in that stand that you have to murder everything that pops up that's not one of those grasses.
Hold off that itchy trigger finger.
Yeah. Because those plants have grown together for a long time,
right,
and they have a lot of benefits that go together. So I would encourage you to think about allowing some of that, like you said earlier, some of that diversity to creep up and see what happens. See if all of a sudden that little patch doesn't get real pretty certain times of the year because there's flowers blooming in it.
Yep.
And that you don't see a bunch of butterflies and bees and, a lot of your songbirds hanging out in there.
Right.
Deer and turkey, and
even if, like I said, we're hunters, so we're approaching this from both a professional and personal type of angle here, but there's a lot of people that don't hunt, but there is still a lot of enjoyment to seeing wildlife.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah.
And I think there's an aspect to be had, an argument to be had for that angle as well, because, they're game species, but they're also using the landscape just like we are. And so I think it's always nice to be able to do something that what little we can while accomplishing the same goal of our production standards and our production goals as a whole throughout the farm system. So we We didn't talk about burning. We'll talk about burning maybe here in just a little bit, possibly.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that. But you can burn native grasses as well. We're technically still in a burn ban here in East Tennessee. We've had a lot of wildfires, so just make sure you're abiding by all the local regulations and what they have out. So make sure you're doing the right thing there. But if you have questions about burning native grasses specifically, that probably will be a handful of people potentially. But we're not going to talk about that too much because I think we're going to talk about it in our next segment, like I mentioned, which leads us into one of the topics that I don't think gets talked about enough. And personally, I visit a lot of, like I mentioned, we have a lot of livestock production in Jeff County, but not just in the county, all of East Tennessee. And most of the time we have, whether it's a 40-acre tract of land or a 60, 80, 100, whatever it might be, no matter how large or small, we probably have a small wood lot on there, right? Mm-hmm. Because our soils here in East Tennessee literally can change with a stone's throw. I mean, you can go from multiple feet of soil to you have bedrock literally 5 feet away. I have seen it my own two eyes. There's a little community called Rocky Valley in Jeff County. If you're from Rocky Valley, you know why they call it Rocky Valley. There's bedrock everywhere in the valley. And so with that being said, let's talk about some small woodlot management.
Okay.
And for this conversation, let's talk like 30 acres and under. Let's say somebody's got a 100-acre place, or let's say like 30% of their farm or their tract of land is in woods or a woodland type habitat. Okay.
Pretty common around here.
Very common, especially for livestock production. And again, just the topography of East Tennessee specifically leads to a lot of that.
Yep.
Because we don't like to drive tractors on hillsides. Excuse me. My in-laws are from Hancock County, and there's some hills in that county, buddy, I would never find myself on a piece of equipment. I don't care if it's a side-by-side. I'm like, ain't doing that.
Yep.
But with that being said, those can be a resource for not only wildlife, but also to a farm, right? And so let's talk about what are if you had to list, let's say 3, maybe 4 management tips for folks who have small woodlots, because ultimately that you can't just, from a property value standpoint, you can't just say, we're just not even going to take care of that 30%.
Yeah.
But sometimes that's what happens in some cases. But that can be a big chunk of change when it comes to whether it's time to sell the property or if you're passing it from the next generation to regain some monetary value back in their pocket there. So what would you advise, or what are some projects you would tell people to consider, or just some management tips you might give them for small woodlots in that type of a scenario?
With a focus on wildlife?
Yeah, we'll do that first. Yeah.
So, well, I guess I'll back up and we'll hit it kind of from a timber and a wildlife standpoint.
Perfect.
The first thing I would tell somebody to do is go walk through it. See what
Amen.
Yeah, see what the heck is in there, man. If you're not familiar with your trees and plant species, grab a field guide or call me. I will.
That's why you got a county agent in your county.
Yeah. Go walk it, figure out what's in there, because that can greatly influence what I would encourage you to do in those areas. So if we're talking about a 30-acre woodlot that's, primo white oak or something, of course, 30 acres isn't a ton, and the way our timber market is right now, that's not really something you should be overly excited about tearing down. But that if that's what it was, then you might look at that a little different than if it's a bunch of, less useful trees. We'll just leave it at that.
Sure. We're not going to pick on anybody today.
Yeah. So, kind of the other side of that is, say it was a ton of poplars, that don't have a ton of wildlife value, or at least as much as a bunch of oaks do anyway. So yeah, go out there, take stock of what's there, get an idea of, when you're thinking about the timber side of it, the age class of those trees. Are they all the same age? Are they different aged?
Get your basis anyway. Is that what you're trying to say?
Essentially, yes. Yeah, figure out. And it's never, you talked about, you mentioned if you're getting ready to sell a piece of property or handing it down, it's a good idea to know what the timber value of that property is.
Absolutely.
Again, maybe with 30 acres, not so much of a big deal, but it's not going to hurt you to have that value in mind.
But if it's a big, pristine white oak stand, it's like, that's got some value to it.
Yeah. So again, the point is we want to think about what's actually there.
Sure.
And the other thing I would highly encourage you to think about is what's the density of that stand. So
right.
Are we talking like, most places around here, closed canopy forest is probably what you would be looking at.
Sure.
Which isn't extremely conducive to a lot of our wildlife. We think about, I think a common misconception is people think about mature forest being the best there is for most of our wildlife species, and that's just not the case.
Nope.
No. So there's one spot in Morgan County I can take you to right now, and I can take you there in the middle of the summer. It don't matter what time of year it is, and it is chock-a-block full of big white oaks and big chestnut oaks and red oaks, a bunch of hickories, and the understory is absolute garbage. There's nothing there.
Just bare leaf litter.
Yeah, right. That's all it is. And so there's no food value there. There's no cover value there. Good timber value, but that's about it.
Looks real pretty on a TV show or a hunting show or something like that.
And a few months out of the year when those acorns drop, it's going to get tore up, and it might provide some travel corridor, but that's about it.
Right.
So that's the kind of things I would encourage people to think about if they've got a woodlot like that, is figuring out just what the heck is there.
Right.
And I think from there, you kind of got to think about, if we're looking at wildlife, you got to think about what's the limiting factor. So you said earlier, wildlife use the landscape.
Right.
Well, so take a look around, not just your property, but on Exit or Google Earth it, whatever, and figure out what does the surrounding area look like. And, it's springtime, so we'll mostly talk about turkeys here for a second.
Absolutely.
And the major limiting factor for turkeys across, basically the entire state is good nesting and brooding cover.
Right.
So one of the most important things you could do is create some of that for those turkeys.
Right.
Now, if you want me to, I can go ahead and start talking about what exactly that means as far as creating that. But, there's a lot of stuff you can get into there. You can get kind of deep in the weeds.
Save the pulse, baby. Save the pulse.
Save the pulse. That is it right there. That is it.
Well, if you don't mind, go ahead. And, I think what questions before we do that, some of the things that I get asked about in Jeff County anyway, and even when I was in Georgia as an agent down there for a couple of years, and of course it's a lot different landscape down there, but your species are a little bit different. You're predominantly still looking at some hickories and and oak based, right? But you got a lot of pine plantations, so management is totally different down there. But like people ask me all the time if they do have a big timber tract. Let's say it's, when I say big for our neck of the woods, is I would say 50 plus acres.
Yep.
Like select cutting, getting rid of those undesirables, and there's a variety of methods you could do that with, whether it's prescribed burns, which we'll get into that just a little bit because that leads me to the topic, or to the benefit for production ag for some folks, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got all kinds of invasives you can hack and square for.
Oh, yeah.
We have a laundry list of them, unfortunately, now. But but anyway, go ahead and dive into the turkey habitat a little bit more.
So, again, the major limiting factor is that nesting habitat.
Right.
So, and brooding habitat, and they're a little bit different, not totally dissimilar, but
they look similar, I would say, to the untrained eye.
Yes.
But to the trained eye, they're vastly different. So if Dr. Craig Harper was sitting there, he would, we could show him a picture and he would say, "Oh no, that's pretty good. Oh no, that's pretty poor." And again, to the everyday person, they may look exactly the same, or they may not be able to spot any differences.
Right.
But explain kind of what those differences are, if you don't mind.
So to make it simple, the idea is brooding habitat is a little bit more open at the ground level.
Right.
So when we talk about baby birds, specifically turkeys and bobwhite and things like that, those little bitty poults cannot walk through things like, well, again, we'll go back to fescue. They can't walk through that. If you've got real thick, brushy areas, even our native grasses, like when you start getting too thick, those little bitty baby birds can't walk through that very well. So that is the major reason why good nesting cover is not necessarily good brooding cover, is that it needs to be a little bit more open at the ground level.
Right. And ideally pretty close by for poult survival.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the big indicators for poult survival, or in the studies it tends to be significant, is if a hen has to take her brood a significant distance to get to decent brooding cover,
right.
and she's walking through a closed canopy forest that has no cover at all.
Right.
Not good for those poults.
No, it's hard to get around.
Yeah. So that's kind of your main difference, is just it needs to be a little bit more open.
Yeah.
And close by.
Yes.
That's important.
Speaking of Dr. Harper, I went back and watched it's a YouTube video they've got about, I think we were talking about with the 46% of nests were in that 7% of landscape.
Watched that on the way here.
We don't geek out about everything, but wild turkeys we geek out a bit.
Yeah.
So there's a study that they showed, and that study specifically we're referring to, and I forget the name of the paper or what it is, but we can look it up if y'all want to later on. Just ask me. But anyway, they tracked this one particular hen, and she had to go, I forget how far it was. It was a long, long way.
If it's the one I'm thinking of, it's like 500 or 600 yards.
Yes, 500 or 600 yards to make it from her nest site to what I guess could be considered brooding cover. Now, what kind of brooding cover that was is irrelevant, I think, because that's not irrelevant to the study, but the fact that she had to travel 500 to 600 yards to find that, that's a long trek for a little baby poult.
Yep.
I think for those of y'all at home who don't know what a baby poult turkey looks like, think about the chicks you may have just gotten from the co-op or Tractor Supply or Rural King, whatever.
Yep.
It's the same type of baby bird.
Yep.
Very similar in size, very similar in structure. Color's going to be a little different, obviously. But think about a little baby chick having to get 500 to 600 yards away.
Yep.
A lot of them are probably not going to make it.
Can't fly, can't run very fast.
Nope.
Yeah.
And everything's out to get them.
Yep. Oh, my goodness, everything.
Everything.
From the egg until, they're grown.
Yes.
Everything wants to eat them.
I heard probably one of the best turkey hunters I've ever been around said, turkeys it's extremely hard to kill them, and if they could smell, you'd never kill one.
Never.
You wouldn't even get close to one. But they always said, they're the most paranoid bird. Like, you think about having to survive, and white-tailed deer this to a certain extent. They always seem like they're paranoid, but turkeys are like ultra paranoid because literally everything's out to get them, and their only defense is really to fly away. There is no fight or flight instinct. It's just fly away.
Throwing a wing at a coyote's not going to do a whole
lot. No, not unless you catch a spur in the eyeball or something like that.
Yeah, a critical hit might do something, but that's not going to happen.
But if they're sneaking up behind you, then you're already behind the 8 ball. So anyway, but that study, if y'all are interested in that kind of stuff, I forget the name of the video or whatever it might be, but Dr. Harper's got a bunch of good stuff out there.
If you YouTube search Craig Harper turkey nesting habitat, it'll probably be the first thing that pops
probably
up.
going to pop up in the algorithm there.
Yeah.
So
talking about that study, one of the most important things about it, and that will relate back to this woodlot thing we're talking about, is so when they did that study, took place in South Middle Tennessee, and I think it lasted, if I'm not mistaken, 5 or 6 years. I mean, it was a multi-year study. I think there's 600 plus nests that were accounted for.
Yeah, this isn't just like 1 or 2 years tracking 2 or 3 hens. We're talking multiple hens across multiple years, across multiple acreages here.
And so one of the things they found was that 7% of the total habitat that was in that study was what we consider early successional habitat. So for those who aren't familiar, that is essentially if you took a forest and cut it down to nothing, those years after that, you'll go through a series of stages, successional stages they call them, where you're going to have different plant communities that are developing over time as that returns to a forest. And in some places, we want to keep early successional habitat around permanently if we can,
right?
Because again, it is a limiting factor in most of East Tennessee, but it is extremely useful to a lot of wildlife. So,
right.
In that study, early successional habitat made up 7% of the total land mass, but 46% of the nests that were monitored in that study were in early successional habitat.
Yeah, that's that's pretty astounding.
Yeah. When nearly half of your nests are in less than 10% of your study area.
Yeah, and so in my train of thought, what that means is it doesn't take a lot of habitat necessarily. You could argue that, but when it's available, a small portion of the landscape is heavily utilized for turkey habitat, for nesting habitat.
They know what they're doing.
They know where it is. Hence why that hen we discussed earlier took her brood 500-600 yards away, because she knew that was the closest place. To say it doesn't take a lot of habitat, that's a misnomer, so forgive me for that. That's not necessarily true. The more the merrier, I think.
Yes.
From a predatory standpoint.
Right.
The more the merrier, because if you only have, like, say you have a 100-acre tract of land and a half acre is designated to early successional habitat, predators eventually learn where that's at too.
All of a sudden, all the turkey hens are trying to fight for a spot in there. Yes. Those coyotes and literally everything else goes, oh, that looks like a smorgasbord there. I think I'll dive into that.
They're not dumb. Predators are not dumb.
Not by any means.
And correct me if I'm wrong. That's why we like to see more of a not a random, but more of a mosaic type pattern to the landscape. If you're in a wildlife,
reasons for that, but that's one of them.
Yes, in a wildlife management perspective, you'll hear that mosaic type of reference made. But that's because there's, again, like Josh mentioned, there's multiple reasons for that. But from a predatory standpoint and survival standpoint, that's where that really enhances the ability for poults to survive, because it's not just a certain given area that's there year after year after year. Predators got to search for them, and that makes it hard.
And so one thing we can do to create that type of habitat in those small woodlots you're talking about is just thin the canopy some. Well, I don't want to make it sound too simple. It is a process like everything else.
Sure.
So if we can come in, ideally you're going to pick out some species, some trees that you definitely want to keep.
Right.
You want to pick some trees that you want to recruit into your next canopy.
Right.
So don't just willy-nilly start whacking stuff and burning it or whatever. But, again, take some stock in what's there, figure out what you want to keep, but open up that canopy.
Right.
So a lot of the primo nest habitat comes from what we call a woodland, and so that kind of falls in the range of like 30 to 70% canopy cover. So we want to really open that up, and from there, that all that additional sunlight hitting the ground in there is going to wake up a lot of species that are in the seed bank there. And so if we can get that woodland area with that kind of open foresty type feel to it, and we can either, in most cases that means burning it, so we mentioned that earlier, that means burning it. Disking it can do some good. Of course, if you're trying to disc around a bunch of trees, it's probably not the funnest thing in the world.
No, been there, done that. It ain't no fun.
Yeah, but so fire is probably the most common way to go about encouraging those species to take off. But if we can get that open woodland with a large herbaceous plant community coming in on that understory, we're going to do a whole lot of good for turkeys. And I
Yeah.
actually have, we mentioned the Wild Turkey Science podcast. There was
Yes.
something that was on there not too long ago that if we have some time at the end, I might run through it.
Yep.
But it was a little bit of napkin math about what habitat improvement can do for turkey survival.
Right. Napkin math, tailgate math. I love it.
Yeah.
Either way.
So that's kind of one of the primary things you can do with an area like that. That's going to be the most beneficial not only to turkeys
Right.
but to deer, a lot of your songbirds. You know, if we can get enough patchwork put together, it can be beneficial to quail. Of course, you know, your single 30-acre woodlot's not going to do a lot for quail, but you know, if all your neighbors are in on it too, that's the way we're going to make a difference
That
for
adds
those
up.
guys.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
But again, the biggest thing primarily we're talking about right now is turkeys, and so you can see some major benefits for creating that turkey habitat, and it's not necessarily the hardest thing in the world to do.
No,
you know?
it's not, and it's. I think a lot of it, specifically with burning, is knowing when to do it, knowing how to do it. Excuse me, and having somebody show you how to do it.
Yeah.
Because controlled burning is not something to be taken lightly.
No.
And we've seen evidence of that here in East Tennessee ever since the Chimney Tops fire.
Yep.
And burned a lot of the Smokies, and then up towards the Kentucky line and the Cherokee National Forest there. So there's it's nothing to be taken lightly for sure.
Right.
But it can bring back so much benefit to a landscape from wildlife.
Yep.
And you mentioned deer. So what that does, burning, for those of y'all at home, it, like Josh mentioned, it brings about a lot of species that more or less have been dormant in the soil bank because you have a closed canopy forest, right? And even removing undesirable trees will do that, opening up that canopy some. But the wildlife and the species that take advantage of it, you said it's good forbs and browse for deer.
Yep.
And this is kind of where I wanted to bring it back around to the production ag side. And so we're not just talking about turkeys and wildlife today. We're talking about some production ag too. But it's my podcast. We're going to talk about wildlife too. So it is what it is. Sorry. But to bring this back around, deer are very highly specific browsers, right? Like because of their mouth parts and their diet and what they desire, they can browse really specific type of plants and high preference. Small ruminants are the exact same way. Sheep, goats, maybe not to the point of a white-tailed deer, but goats are a lot of times. And I see a lot of people keeping small ruminants out of woodlots. And I'm sitting there thinking, boy, you have an opportunity to have a buffet in front of them, and you're really missing an opportunity there. But with that being said, if you have, say you have a 25-acre piece of ground, 5 of it's woods, you could probably produce, I'm not going to say as much forage, but you're going to be able to produce a lot of groceries in that wood lot if you were to open up the canopy, burn it on a rotation, every 3-4 years. If you're doing for production ag purpose, maybe 2 years, 3 years, probably the best.
Yeah.
But to manage for that early successional community, and don't necessarily turn them in there whenever turkeys are nesting and things like that, because you're going to find deer in there as well. Deer will find it. But boy, you can grow a lot of groceries in a place like that. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but we were at an in-service. Well, it was Extension Conference when Dr. Harper gave a little talk about food plots and why you food plots versus early successional habitats, and the sheer amount of tonnage you can produce from an early successional area, an early successional woodland, is astounding. And he threw that slide up and threw those data points up, and I sat back in my chair and I thought, why in the world are we planting food plots? Because, I know why we are, because it's it's more attractive in the fall of the year. You get shots at animals, and for a hunting purpose, that's why you do it. But for feeding a herd of deer or for feeding wildlife and for production ag, if you're trying to feed small ruminants, dude, it's the way to go, man.
For sure.
It's an easy thing to do. And we say that like it's, you and I could go and do it today if we wanted to. Not really, because we're in a burn ban, can't do that right now. But you and I have the knowledge to make that happen. And I think there's a lot of folks out there that don't necessarily have that knowledge, but you don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why county agents, really can help you out with that, is because I may not have the expertise on something, but I know that Josh does, hence why he's on the podcast with me today, and vice versa. So there is an aspect to just don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times people are very, very afraid to do that. And that sounds like a wild idea. It's really not. It's really not. It's not at all. Because, all you're doing is taking advantage of what landscape you have and using it for your production goals in an ag setting. So, I think that's something that people do way too often, is just don't ask questions.
Yeah. Yeah. And then what ends up happening is, like an area we're talking about, a little small woodlot like that, it just sits and
leaf litter. That's what accumulates.
Leaf litter and some invasive
Chinese
stuff.
privet.
And, all kinds of stuff
started.
that it's just it degrades over time, really. When you're not paying attention to it, because a lot of it starts from the edges.
Yeah.
Like you said, privet and stuff, and then it starts creeping towards the inside, and it just
There was a place in Georgia that that I didn't get the chance to hunt because of COVID and various reasons. We got permission on it like the end of deer season. Excuse me. The end of deer season, and then the spring we were putting cameras out, whatever. Mm-hmm. And there were quite a few nice bucks on there, but this place was overgrown with privet. I'm talking about I couldn't walk through it. I don't know how a white-tailed deer was going to get through it. I do, but they'll get through just about anything almost. But I'm sitting there thinking, man, if you're trying to hunt this and be quiet and sneak up in places, there's no way you're going to do it.
Nope.
And privet spreads so fast, and it's so hard to kill.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, it's tougher than a 2x4. No.
It's a lifelong battle.
Yeah, unfortunately. And I think we're stuck with a lot of lifelong battles at our age, unfortunately. But
yeah,
it is what it is. We're here for the long haul.
That's it.
So, okay, we're going on. How long do you think we've been talking?
I'm going to say an hour and a half.
No, not quite. Hour 10 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Hour and 8. We're not quite there.
All right.
But honestly, I don't know how long my memory card will hold up. So we're gonna start towards the end of the downhill slide here. We have mentioned that we're both turkey hunters, both avid outdoorsmen. So what's your 2025 turkey season outlook look like?
Well, so I am a pretty bad turkey hunter. I make no bones about that. So I will say this. I started out life as just a wildlife nerd. Mm-hmm. Like, I didn't grow up hunting. I didn't even get into it for the most part until I was in college.
Right.
So yeah, I'm a pretty bad turkey hunter. And so really my goal is to just be out there and have a good time and hear some turkeys. And if I get to shoot one, then by God, I'm going to be happy about it.
Well, you hit the nail on the head if you get to hear one.
Yeah.
Because, this will be my 19th year hunting turkeys. I'm not trying to give my age away, but I started hunting them at an early age. And so I started during the heyday of turkey hunting. Like, our piece of property in Middle Tennessee, it's right at 50 acres. And not all these birds were on our property, but from our property, you could hear it was nothing to hear 8 to 10, maybe even 12 to 15 in one morning. Just firing off, gobbling their heads off. Now, it's a good day if you hear 3 or 4. Mm-hmm. It's really sad, and that's not.
A lot of places are like that.
I was gonna say that's about all we hear now, unfortunately, isn't it? Oh, it used to be like this.
I hear it from everybody.
Yeah.
Where'd they go?
Yep.
Habitat went away.
Yep. Habitat went away.
Predators don't help, but habitat went away.
Yeah, and you talk about a polarizing argument there. If you ask 10 turkey hunters, what's happened to the turkey population, they'll say they'll all have a different answer, and they're solely convinced that's exactly what it is, right? Yep. It's all predators. There's more predators than ever. Well, it might be true, and there's also a lot less habitat. There's also a lot less management that goes into it as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a Pandora's box I don't want to open.
Yeah.
At least not on air. But yeah, so we got to get together and hunt this spring for sure.
Yes.
I got a new vest this time.
Oh yeah?
Yep. I'm pretty excited about it. Got my days marked off on the calendar. I'm taking off work, so we're gonna be.
I haven't got that far yet. I haven't started marking days off yet. But
well, when you have 2 kids, you got to go ahead and do it.
That's fair. Part of my problem is, like, after I go a few times and I'm not super successful. I'm like everybody else. I'm not hearing a ton of birds, so I'm like, that river's calling my name.
Crappie start biting.
Yeah.
I'm a big fly fisherman. The mountains start getting pretty appealing. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, we need to do that sometime too. I went and visited Little River Outfitters for the first time. Oh man. Yeah. So I got a little fired up about that. But anyway, so I don't want to get too far off track. But so I know we're getting towards wrapping up here. So I do want to hit this real quick. So
Go for it.
We've talked about the fact that we're hearing less gobblers. Our habitat's gone away. Our predators have gone up.
Yep.
And so we're sitting here talking about what can we do with a little woodlot to improve turkey habitat, right? Well, so again, going back to the Wild Turkey Science guys, and again, if you're a turkey guy, you need to listen to that podcast. They're super awesome. But I pulled this from one of their more recent podcasts where Dr. Goolsby took a bunch of studies.
Right.
And took numbers from a bunch of different studies where they were doing different things.
Yeah.
And put it to what you can actually see.
Right.
Like, it gives you something to think about, to look forward to. Okay. So I'm going to try to explain this the best I can. I tried to make it real simple. There is some rounding and some fudging on some numbers, but it all comes out pretty much,
it's we'll say relative accuracy.
Yes. Yes. But either way, it comes out to being pretty spectacular.
Pretty astounding.
Yes. Okay. So we start with 50 hens.
Okay.
The size of the property does not matter.
Okay.
Okay. 50 hens. Typical nest initiation is about 80%.
Okay.
So we had 50 hens. 40 of those are actually going to make a nest.
I was going to say, nest initiation is the act of trying to
make a nest.
Yep. Okay.
And so the average clutch size is about 10 eggs.
Okay.
Okay. So now we have 400 eggs.
Right.
From there, the average nest success is in the mid to upper 30s.
Okay.
Now, it's important to note that these numbers are coming from just the average unimproved habitat.
Sure.
Okay. So mid to upper 30s on nest success. And when we're talking about that here, we're just going to assume nest success means all 10 eggs hatch.
Right.
Okay. So the number that Dr. Goolsby pulled was 13 nests.
Right.
Out of those 40, and so that is 130 poults.
Okay.
Okay. So the poult survival from 0 to 1 month is roughly a third.
Okay.
Okay. So now we take that 130 poults and reduce it by a third.
Okay.
And again, this is where some of the fudging comes in.
Yeah.
But he came out to 39 poults out of that 130, make it to 1 month. Okay. From there, we have about a 50-50% sex ratio.
Right.
Okay. So 20 roughly of those birds, those 1 month old poults, are males. Yep.
Yeah.
And so only about half of those make it to be a 2-year-old gobbler that you have the opportunity to hunt.
Yikes.
So we started with 50 hens, and out of that we get maybe 10 2-year-old gobblers on the average habitat. Okay.
Average habitat. Okay.
So not the stuff that's ideal.
Right.
Okay. Not the stuff that we've been sitting here going back and forth talking
Not the
about.
stuff that has been actively, purposefully managed.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, he took the same scenario and pulled numbers from places that had been managed. Okay.
Right.
So we start with those same 50 hens.
Right.
Okay. But in the improved habitat, you see an increased nest initiation. So he went from 80% to 90% of those hens actually making a nest. Okay. So we've gone from 40 to 45 nests. Of those 45 nests, we're going to keep the same clutch size because there's not really anything that shows improved habitat means improved clutch size. 10's pretty much it. So we're at 450 eggs.
Okay.
Okay. From there, we can show that nest success goes from that mid to upper 30s up to 50% nest success.
Yeah.
Okay, so half the nests actually hatch and have poults.
Right.
And again, we're assuming that all 10 eggs hatch. So we've gone from 450 eggs to 230 poults. Now keep in mind, that's 100 more poults than in our previous scenario.
Right.
Our poult survival, there wasn't a strong correlation in poult survival necessarily, but it is, that doesn't mean that it's because of a lack of study or, it's kind of within the realm of logic to say if you have the improved habitat, you've got brooding habitat closer,
there's going to be a higher number or higher chance of them surviving.
Yeah, and so he conservatively bumped up the poult survival from 30 to 40%. So now we go from 230 poults to 92 poults that make it to a month old.
Right.
Okay, and so from there, it's the same math. Half of those are going to be male, and half of those
are going to make it to maturity.
So we end up with 23 2-year-old gobblers
versus 10.
Yeah, so almost 2.5 times as many gobblers just by doing some improved nest and brooding habitat.
And that was, correct me if I'm wrong, that was the property size was irrelevant.
Yeah,
so no matter if it was a 50-acre piece or a 500-acre piece,
right,
2.5 seemed to be,
right,
or almost 2.5.
Because we're just assuming 50 hens.
Sure.
You can do the same math with, a huge property that has 100 birds or whatever. The math comes out the same. The percentages and things come out the same. So that's why he didn't really,
Yeah, because, again, wildlife use the landscape.
Right.
We see it as property boundaries.
Right.
Yeah.
And another part of that is, he didn't increase the number of gobblers that made it from to that 2-year-old stage, and it is totally within logic to say that improved habitat's also going to help the survival rate of those jakes.
Absolutely.
But we just kept it the way it was, and you ended up with almost 2.5 times as many gobblers.
Well, think about how many longbeards I've gotten at 40, 45, 50 yards, and it just needed 4 or 5 more steps, but I had to watch him walk away.
Yep.
How many of the one that got away stories, right?
Yep.
And that's not accounting for those either.
Yeah, and
crazy.
So you double the amount of gobblers that you're looking at, and all of a sudden they get mad and compete with each other, so they're a little bit more anxious to head towards that call.
Yes.
Or you get one that's a little bit light in the brain cell area, and he might come in a little quicker. So more gobblers is probably not only a greater chance of success because there's more of them, but just because they're going to act in different ways.
Very much so.
Whether they are competing or they're just a little bit dumb, it's going to help you out.
Right.
So, and again, these numbers all came from real studies that have been done. We can see this if we just implement some of these habitat practices we're talking about and improving that nesting cover.
Yeah, and it doesn't, and I guess that's our sales pitch for those who are involved in production ag to, again, it doesn't take a lot. It doesn't take a lot. So let's say 3 out of say you have 10 landowners sitting in a room or, that are contiguous to one another. If 2 of them did some habitat project, that's going to help.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess one of my closing points here is that, no matter how small or large the project is, every little bit's going to help. It's not going to hurt.
Yeah.
And it's just like farmland. Quality habitat for wildlife is disappearing at an alarming rate. That's a whole different podcast we're going to cover one day. And the stat that I think people don't necessarily think about a lot is that majority of our lands here in Tennessee are privately owned. And that's majority for most states out there.
Yep.
So really it's up to the private landowner, regardless of what their goals are at the end of the day. It's up to the private landowner to take it upon themselves to do some of this. And so that's kind of our challenge to some of you out there. I know some of y'all are hunters and outdoorsmen and fishermen. I guess that's our plea to save the Pulse.
Yeah.
That was one of the, Michael Waddell's Can't Stop the Flop campaign a couple of years ago.
Yep.
But I actually got to meet him. Random side note, this will be a good closing. Random side note, I got to meet him not at like a convention or meet and greet, whatever. It was through work.
Really?
I was in Meriwether County, Georgia, for my first job. And I was visiting Mr. Steve Morgan, who is the agent in Harris County. Ironically, is where the Realtree folks live, and that's where a lot of them are based out of. And so it was to the southwest of my county, and our county is very similar in that. So I was down there visiting with Steve one day, and I came in right after lunch, and I was sitting with his admin at the front of the office, Miss Martha, there, and she was like, "Yeah, he's got somebody in the office, but they're almost done. He'll be right out." And I'm like, "Okay." And I can hear him talking in there. The guy had a big resounding, booming voice, and I was sitting there thinking, that guy sounds familiar. And then the door opens, and then Steve walks out, and then I see this guy, and I can, like when you hear a voice and you're like, gosh, I recognize that. I don't know where it's from though.
Oh yeah.
I thought, there's literally no way. About that time, Michael Waddell pops out. For those of y'all who don't know who that is, he's like he wouldn't call himself a celebrity, but he truly is a hunting celebrity. I mean, he's big in the Realtree road trips and video world. Mm-hmm. Bone Collector is his brand, for those of y'all who know what that is out there now. But yeah, it's Michael Waddell and Flesh and Blood. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is really cool. And I'm really trying not to freak out right now, because I literally grew up watching his videos.
Yep.
And he shook my hand, just like he was a regular person right off the street. Dude is tall. He's like 6'3", 6'4". I mean, I'm 6'1".
Everybody's tall compared to me. So.
Well, I'm 6'1", 6'2", depending on what pair of boots I've got on that day. But I mean, I was like, okay, this Joker is a pretty big guy.
Yeah.
But totally down to earth, really, really cool. And he was getting advice for his pecan grove, his pecan trees on his property. So if you watch the Bone Collector videos, that pecan grove, that's what he was getting advice about. So even Michael Waddell uses his extension agent. There's your pitch right there.
There you go.
So, well, anything else you want to add, my friend? We're going on an hour 23 minutes here. So,
just if you're in production agriculture, just consider doing a little bit for wildlife. Give a little.
It don't take a lot, like Josh mentioned.
It don't take a lot, yeah. Because like you said, we're losing those green spaces, whether it's ag or forestry. All of our wildlife habitat is disappearing, and it's really sad. And we, as stewards of the land, need to step up and do something about it.
Yeah, it really is up to us.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not like states like Montana or Idaho or where they have bukus of public lands out there.
Yeah.
Here it's privately owned. And so, again, I think I echo Josh, and that's kind of the challenge we have for y'all today is do just a little bit. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be a lot, just a little bit. But if everybody does a little bit, that pulls a lot of weight in the long run. So whether it's planting native grasses for both maybe some wildlife benefit and some forage production if you're in the livestock world, or if it's utilizing and burning small woodlots, stuff like that, open up that canopy a little bit. You can use that for sheep and goats pretty easily and get really good forbs and grazing out of that too as well. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
All right, man. Well, hey, I appreciate you coming on. It is Friday, and it's almost quitting time. So almost quitting time. We'll get out of here before Knoxville traffic is done, out, and it's spring break. There really ain't too much traffic. Knock on wood.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you guys for listening to this podcast. We greatly appreciate it. If you do us a favor, like and subscribe, and share with your friends and family. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to having you back for our next episode here. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. Appreciate it.